The massive starship Celestial Dawn floated through space like a giant silver needle, threading through the darkness between stars. Inside its gleaming halls, 3,000 passengers lived in comfort as the ship carried them from Earth to the colony world of New Haven. The journey would take 2 weeks through hyperspace, and for most people aboard, it was the trip of a lifetime. Dr. Grace Washington walked slowly through the first-class section, her small travel bag in one hand and her boarding pass in the other. At 55 years old, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen much of the galaxy. Her dark skin showed the wisdom lines of a woman who had spent decades solving problems that others thought impossible. She wore a simple blue dress and comfortable shoes, nothing fancy or expensive looking. Grace found her cabin and slid the keycard into the lock. The door opened to reveal a spacious room with a large window showing the stars outside. She set her bag on the bed and looked around. The room was bigger than her apartment back on Earth. She had not asked for such luxury, but the Colonial Science Council had insisted on first-class tickets for her return journey. She opened her bag and pulled out a thick folder of papers. These documents contained the most important work of her career. For the past 6 months, she had been living on a research station near the edge of human space, working with alien beings called Zephyrians. These crystal-like creatures had never spoken to humans before, but Grace had found a way to communicate with them. The breakthrough had come when she realized that Zephyrians did not use sound to talk. Instead, they changed colors in their crystal bodies to share thoughts and feelings. Grace had spent weeks learning their color language, sitting for hours with patient Zephyrian teachers who flashed different shades of blue and green and purple to show her their words. Now, because of her work, humans and Zephyrians had signed their first trade agreement. The aliens would share their advanced technology for growing food in space, and humans would provide them with rare metals from asteroid mines. This deal would help feed millions of people in the outer colonies and make both species stronger. Grace did not think of herself as a hero. She was just a scientist who liked solving puzzles, but she knew that her work would change the lives of countless humans across the galaxy. Still, she preferred to travel quietly. She had learned long ago that some people did not like to see a black woman in positions of importance, even in the year 2387. She walked to the window and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there was her daughter Lisa, commanding her own starship and protecting human colonies from pirates and hostile aliens. Grace felt proud when she thought of Lisa. The young woman had worked hard to become one of the youngest ship captains in the colonial fleet. A soft chime told Grace that dinner service was starting in the first-class dining room. She closed her folder of papers and prepared to leave her cabin. As she opened the door, she heard loud voices coming from the lounge area down the hall. Grace walked toward the voices and saw a crowd of passengers gathered around the bar. In the center of the group stood a tall white man in an expensive suit. He had gray hair and cold blue eyes, and he was talking loudly to anyone who would listen. "I am telling you, this ship is not what it used to be," the man said, waving his drink in the air. "They let anyone buy first-class tickets now. In my day, you had to earn your place among decent people." Grace recognized the type immediately. She had met men like this her whole life, men who believed that money and skin color determined a person's worth. She tried to walk past the group, quietly, but the man noticed her. "You there," he called out, pointing at Grace. "Are you lost? The economy section is on the lower decks." Grace stopped and looked at the man calmly. "I am not lost," she said in a quiet voice. "I am going to dinner." The man laughed, but it was not a friendly sound. "Dinner? In the first-class dining room? I think there has been a mistake with your ticket." "There is no mistake," Grace replied. She showed him her boarding pass. "I have a first-class ticket just like you." The man looked at the ticket and frowned. His name was Richard Blake, and he owned several mining companies in the outer colonies. He had built his fortune by being aggressive and getting his way through intimidation. He was not used to being questioned by anyone, especially not by a black woman. "Anyone can fake a ticket these days," Blake said loudly. "Security is terrible on these ships. They probably let you on board by mistake." Other passengers began to look uncomfortable. Some moved away from the argument, not wanting to get involved. Others stayed to watch, curious about what would happen next. Grace had faced this kind of treatment many times before. As a young scientist, she had been the only black woman in most of her classes and research teams. She had learned to stay calm and speak with dignity, even when others tried to make her angry. "My ticket is real," she said simply. "I paid for my cabin like everyone else." Blake stepped closer to Grace, trying to intimidate her with his size. "Look, lady, I do not know what game you are playing, but first class is for people who belong here. People who have earned their place through hard work and success." "And what makes you think I have not worked hard?" Grace asked. Blake laughed again. "What could you possibly have done to afford a first-class ticket? Let me guess, some government program paid for it? Some charity for your people?" Grace felt her anger rise, but she kept her voice steady. "My work speaks for itself." "Your work?" Blake looked around at the other passengers, as if sharing a joke. "What work? What could someone like you possibly do that would matter to anyone?" Grace could have told him about her years of study, her research with alien species, her role in preventing wars and making peace between different worlds. But she had learned that men like Blake did not listen to facts when their minds were already made up. Instead, she simply said, "I am a scientist." Blake snorted. "A scientist, right, and I am the Emperor of Mars." He turned to the other passengers. "This is exactly what is wrong with the colonies these days. Standards have completely disappeared." Grace walked away from Blake and headed toward the dining room. She would not let this man ruin her evening or her journey home. Behind her, she heard Blake continuing to complain to anyone who would listen about the declining quality of passengers on luxury ships. As she entered the elegant dining room with its crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths, Grace wondered if the next 2 weeks would be filled with more of the same treatment. She hoped not, but she was prepared to face whatever came with the same quiet strength that had carried her through a lifetime of challenges. She did not know that her daughter, Lisa, was the captain of this very ship, or that Richard Blake's harassment was about to lead to the most dramatic moment of both their lives. The next morning, Grace woke early and went to the ship's observation deck to watch the stars. She had always found peace in looking at the vast space around them. The celestial dawn was traveling through hyperspace, which made the stars look like long streaks of light flowing past the windows. She sat in a comfortable chair with her morning coffee and opened her research notes. Grace wanted to prepare for her presentation to the Colonial Science Council when she reached New Haven. Her work with the Zephyrians was just the beginning. She believed that humans could make friends with many more alien species if they approached them with respect and patience. Well. "Look who is back in first class," came a familiar voice behind her. Grace did not need to turn around to know that Richard Blake had found her again. She continued reading her papers and ignored him. Blake walked around to face her, blocking her view of the stars. He was dressed in another expensive suit, this one dark blue with gold buttons. His face showed the kind of anger that came from not getting his way. "I talked to the purser last night," Blake said loudly. "I told him about your fake ticket situation. He said he would look into it." Grace looked up at Blake calmly. "And what did he find?" Blake's face turned red. "He said your ticket was real, but I know you did not pay for it yourself. Someone else bought it for you, did they not? Some kind of special program for minorities." Other passengers in the observation deck began to notice the argument. A young couple moved to seats farther away. An elderly man put down his newspaper and watched with concern. "How I paid for my ticket is none of your business," Grace said quietly. "It is my business when people like you take away opportunities from people who deserve them," Blake replied. "First class should be for successful people, not for charity." Cases. Grace closed her research folder and stood up. She was shorter than Blake, but she carried herself with such dignity that she seemed taller. "You know nothing about me or my life. You judge me only by the color of my skin." "I judge you by what I see," Blake said. "And what I see is someone who does not belong here." A woman sitting nearby finally spoke up. "Sir, please leave her alone. She is not bothering anyone." Blake turned to the woman angrily. "Stay out of this. This is between me and her." Grace walked toward the exit, but Blake stepped in front of her again. "We are not finished talking." "Yes, we are," Grace said firmly. "Please move out of my way." Blake crossed his arms and did not move. Not until you admit that you do not belong in first class. Grace looked around the observation deck. Most passengers were now watching the confrontation, but none of them seemed willing to help. She had seen this before. People were afraid to get involved when someone was being bullied, even when they knew it was wrong. "I will not admit something that is not true," Grace said. "Now please move." "The truth is that people like you are ruining this ship and every other good thing in the colonies," Blake said, his voice getting louder. "You take jobs and opportunities away from hardworking families. You get special treatment because of your race, not because you earned it." Grace felt her patience wearing thin. She had dealt with men like Blake her entire career, but it never got easier. She thought about her daughter Lisa, who was probably facing similar challenges as a young woman in the military. Grace knew she had to stay strong, not just for herself, but as an example for other women who might face the same treatment. "I have worked for everything I have achieved," Grace said clearly. "I earned my education, I earned my job, and I earned this ticket through my own labor." Blake laughed mockingly. "What labor? What could you possibly do that would be worth a first-class ticket on the most expensive ship in the fleet?" Before Grace could answer, Blake continued his attack. "Let me guess. You work in some government office, pushing papers around and collecting a paycheck for doing nothing useful." Grace could have told him the truth. She could have explained that she was one of the most important scientists in human space. That her work had just prevented a potential war and opened up new possibilities for trade and cooperation. But she had learned that men like Blake did not listen to facts that challenged their beliefs. Instead, she simply said, "I work in research." "Research?" Blake repeated with contempt. "Probably some made-up job studying things that do not matter to real people. While hard-working folks like me build the colonies and create jobs, people like you sit in comfortable offices and waste taxpayer money on useless projects." The elderly man who had been watching finally stood up. "Young man, that is enough. You are being very rude to this lady." Blake turned his anger toward the older passenger. "Mind your own business, old man. This does not concern you. When I see someone being mistreated, it concerns me." The elderly man replied firmly, "My name is Frank Miller, and I fought in the colonial wars to protect the rights of all humans, not just the ones who look like me." Blake looked around the observation deck and saw that most passengers were now staring at him with disapproval. But instead of backing down, he became more aggressive. "Fine," Blake said loudly. "If you all want to pretend that she belongs here, go ahead. But I know what I see, and what I see is someone who got her ticket through special treatment, not through merit." Grace had heard enough. She walked toward Blake and looked directly into his eyes. "You are wrong about me. You are wrong about everything you think you know. But I will not waste any more time trying to educate someone who does not want to learn." She walked around Blake and headed for the exit. Behind her, she heard Blake calling out to the other passengers. "Do not let her fool you with that act," Blake said. "People like her are experts at playing the victim. They use guilt and sympathy to get things they have not earned." Grace left the observation deck and went to the ship's library, hoping to find some peace there. But even in the quiet library, she could not stop thinking about Blake's words. She had spent her whole life proving that she belonged wherever her talents took her. It was exhausting to constantly face people who refused to see her as anything more than the color of her skin. She opened her research notes again and tried to focus on her work. The Zephyrians had been so different from humans in many ways, but they had treated her with respect from the first moment they met. They judged her by her actions and her knowledge, not by her appearance. Grace wondered if humans would ever learn to do the same for each other. As she worked in the library, Grace did not know that Richard Blake was becoming more determined to make her journey miserable. He spent the rest of the day talking to other first-class passengers, trying to convince them that Grace did not belong among them. Most passengers ignored him, but a few seemed to listen with interest. The conflict was far from over, and Blake was preparing to escalate his harassment to a level that would force the ship's captain to take action. 3 days into the journey, Grace tried to enjoy a quiet dinner in the first-class dining room. She sat alone at a small table by the window, reading her research notes while eating. The food was excellent, but she could not fully enjoy it because she felt Blake watching her from across the room. Blake had spent the past 2 days bothering her at every opportunity. He made loud comments when she entered rooms. He questioned staff members about her ticket. He even followed her to the ship's gym and complained that she was using equipment meant for real first-class passengers. Grace had reported Blake's behavior to the ship's security officer, but the man seemed reluctant to take action against a wealthy passenger. He promised to keep an eye on the situation, but did nothing to stop Blake's harassment. Tonight, Blake was sitting with 3 other passengers who seemed to agree with his complaints. Grace could hear them talking and laughing, occasionally looking in her direction. She tried to ignore them and focus on her meal. As Grace finished her dinner and prepared to leave, Blake stood up from his table and walked toward her. His face was flushed red from drinking wine, and he moved with the confident swagger of someone who believed he was about to win a fight. "Excuse me," Blake said loudly, standing between Grace and the exit. "I think we need to settle this situation once and for all." Grace looked up at him calmly. "There is nothing to settle. Please let me pass." "Oh, but there is," Blake replied, his voice carrying across the dining room. "You see, I have been doing some research of my own. I asked around about you, and nobody knows who you are or what you do. Nobody has ever heard of any important work you claim to have done." Other diners stopped eating and turned to watch the confrontation. The dining room grew quiet except for Blake's voice. "I think you are a fraud," Blake continued. "I think you somehow got a fake ticket, and now you are pretending to be someone important to avoid getting caught." Grace stood up slowly, her research folder in her hands. "You are wrong, as usual. Now please move." Blake stepped closer to her, using his size to intimidate her. "I am not moving until you admit the truth. Tell everyone here that you do not belong in first class. Tell them that you got your ticket through some charity program because you could never afford it yourself. I will not lie to make you feel better about yourself," Grace said firmly. Blake's anger exploded. He reached out and grabbed Grace's research folder, pulling it from her hands before she could stop him. "Let us see what kind of important research you really do," Blake said, opening the folder and scattering papers across the floor. Grace gasped and dropped to her knees to collect her papers. These documents contained months of careful work, notes about Zephyrian language and culture that existed nowhere else. Some of the papers were originals that could not be replaced. "Stop," Grace said urgently. "Those papers are very important." Blake laughed and kicked at the papers, sending them sliding across the dining room floor. "Important? These look like children's drawings to me. What are these, some kind of art project?" Grace frantically gathered her research notes, trying to keep the papers in order. Other passengers watched but did not help. Some looked uncomfortable, but none of them stood up to Blake. "You want to know what I think?" Blake said, standing over Grace as she collected her papers. "I think you are some kind of con artist. You probably stole these papers from a real scientist, and now you are pretending they are yours." Grace stood up with her papers clutched against her chest. Her hands were shaking with anger, but her voice remained steady. "You have no right to touch my work." "Your work?" Blake laughed again. "A cleaning lady has more important work than whatever this nonsense is supposed to be." The insult hit Grace like a physical blow. She had spent her entire career fighting against people who assumed that a black woman could not be a serious scientist. She had earned multiple degrees, published dozens of research papers, and made discoveries that changed how humans understood alien life. But to Blake, she would always be just a cleaning lady. "That is enough," came a strong voice from the entrance to the dining room. Everyone turned to see a woman in a dark blue military uniform walking toward them. She was young, probably in her 30s, with short black hair and serious dark eyes. Her uniform had the gold stripes of a ship's captain, and she carried herself with the authority of someone used to commanding others. Captain Lisa Washington had been monitoring the situation through the ship's security cameras. She had watched Blake harass her mother for 3 days, growing angrier with each incident. She had wanted to intervene earlier, but she also knew that her mother was strong enough to handle difficult people. Grace had been dealing with men like Blake her entire life. But when Blake physically grabbed her mother's research papers and scattered them on the floor, Lisa decided that enough was enough. She left the bridge and came to the dining room personally. "Is there a problem here?" "Captain," Washington asked, her voice calm but carrying clear authority. Blake straightened up and smiled, thinking he had found an ally. "Captain, thank you for coming. I have been trying to report a problem passenger, but your security staff has not been helpful." "What kind of problem?" the captain asked. Blake pointed at Grace, who was still holding her scattered papers. "This woman has been disrupting first class for days. I believe she has a fraudulent ticket and does not belong here. She claims to be some kind of scientist, but look at this nonsense she calls research." Blake pointed at the papers on the floor. "Anyone can see that these are just random scribbles. She is obviously lying about her qualifications." Captain Washington looked at the papers on the floor, then at her mother, then back at Blake. Her expression did not change, but her eyes grew colder. "I see," the captain said. "And what would you like me to do about this situation?" Blake puffed out his chest, confident that he was about to get his way. "I want her removed from first class immediately. She should be moved to economy class, where she belongs. Or better yet, put in the ship's brig for fraud." "You want me to arrest this woman for fraud?" the captain asked. "Yes," Blake said firmly, "and I want her banned from the first-class areas for the rest of the journey. Paying passengers should not have to deal with this kind of disruption." Captain Washington nodded slowly as if considering Blake's request. The dining room was completely silent now, with all eyes on the three of them. "Very well," the captain said. "I will handle this situation personally." Blake smiled triumphantly and looked around the dining room as if expecting applause. He had finally gotten the authority figure he needed to put Grace in her place, but Captain Washington was not. Finished speaking, she turned to face Grace directly, and for the first time since entering the dining room, her serious expression softened into a warm smile. "Hello, Mom," Captain Washington said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent dining room. "I am very sorry that you have had to deal with this treatment aboard my ship." The word "Mom" echoed through the dining room like a thunderclap. Every passenger froze in their seats. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the soft background music seemed to pause as everyone tried to understand what they had just heard. Richard Blake's face went from red to white in seconds. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. He looked back and forth between Captain Washington and Grace, his brain struggling to process what was happening. Grace smiled at her daughter with pride and love. Despite everything that had happened over the past 3 days, seeing Lisa in her captain's uniform filled her heart with joy. Her little girl had grown up to command one of the finest ships in the colonial fleet. "Hello, sweetheart," Grace said warmly. "I did not know you were the captain of this ship. They just told me I would be traveling on the Celestial Dawn." Captain Washington walked over to her mother and gently took the scattered research papers from her hands. She looked at them with recognition and respect. "Are these your notes from the Zephyrian contact mission?" Lisa asked, carefully organizing the papers. "Yes," Grace replied. "I was reviewing them for my presentation to the Colonial Science Council." Lisa turned to address the dining room full of shocked passengers. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying the authority of someone used to commanding thousands of people. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to meet Dr. Grace Washington. She is not only my mother, but she is also one of the most important scientists in human space." Blake finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "Your mother, but she is, and you are black?" Captain Washington finished for him, her voice sharp as a knife. "Yes, we are both black women. Is that a problem for you, Mr. Blake?" Blake stammered and stepped backward. I did not. I never thought." "You never thought what?" Lisa asked, stepping closer to Blake. "You never thought that a black woman could be a starship captain? You never thought that a black woman could be a brilliant scientist? Or did you just never think at all?" The captain's words hit Blake like physical blows. He looked around the dining room for support, but every passenger was staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to disgust to anger. Lisa continued speaking to the assembled passengers. My mother, Dr. Grace Washington, has spent the last 6 months on a research station at the edge of human space. She was there as humanity's first ambassador to an alien species called the Zephyrians. She held up Grace's research papers. These notes that this man just scattered on the floor like trash? They contain the key to communicating with beings made of living crystal. My mother learned their language when no other human could even figure out how they think. Blake tried to interrupt. I did not know. How could I have known? Captain Washington silenced him with a look. You did not know because you did not bother to ask. You judged my mother based only on the color of her skin. You decided she was worthless before you ever spoke to her. Grace put a gentle hand on her daughter's arm. Lisa, it is all right. I have dealt with people like Mr. Blake before. No, Mom, it is not all right, Lisa replied firmly. You should not have to deal with this kind of treatment, especially not on my ship. Lisa turned back to address the passengers. 3 weeks ago, the Zephyrian Federation was preparing for war against humanity. They thought we were planning to attack their worlds and steal their resources. If that war had started, millions of humans would have died. The dining room was completely silent now. Every person was hanging on the captain's words. But my mother prevented that war, Lisa continued. She spent months learning to communicate with beings so different from us that most scientists thought it was impossible. She showed the Zephyrians that humans want to be friends, not enemies. Blake's legs felt weak. He grabbed onto a nearby chair to steady himself. Because of my mother's work, Lisa said, humans and Zephyrians signed a peace treaty last week. They are now sharing technology that will help us grow food in space and travel faster between stars. Her work will save lives and improve the future for every human in the galaxy. Lisa walked over to Blake and stood directly in front of him. This woman that you have been harassing for 3 days? She is a hero. She has done more to help humanity than most people could do in 10 lifetimes. Blake's voice came out as a whisper. I did not know. You did not know because you did not want to know, Lisa replied. You saw a black woman and decided she must be inferior to you. You never considered that she might be smarter than you, more educated than you, or more important than you. Grace stepped forward and spoke gently. Captain, I think Mr. Blake understands now. Do you understand, Mr. Blake? Lisa asked. Do you understand that you have spent 3 days insulting one of humanity's greatest living scientists? Do you understand that you scattered research notes that could help save lives? Do you understand that your prejudice made you blind to greatness? Blake nodded weakly, unable to speak. Lisa continued. My mother has 3 doctorate degrees. She speaks 7 human languages and can now communicate with 2 alien species. She has written over 100 research papers and won the Colonial Medal of Honor for her diplomatic service. She paused and looked around the dining room. How many of you in this room have accomplished half as much? How many of you have literally prevented wars and saved lives through your work? An elderly woman at a nearby table stood up and began clapping. Soon other passengers joined her until the entire dining room was applauding Grace. Some people had tears in their eyes as they realized they had witnessed something shameful. Grace looked embarrassed by the attention, but Lisa smiled with pride. But none of that should matter, Lisa said as the applause died down. Even if my mother were not a famous scientist, she would still deserve to be treated with respect. Every person on this ship, regardless of their race or background, deserves basic human decency. Blake finally managed to speak. Dr. Washington, I owe you an apology. I was wrong about everything. Grace looked at Blake with the same calm dignity she had shown throughout his harassment. Apology accepted, Mr. Blake, but the real question is whether you have learned anything from this experience. Blake nodded rapidly. Yes, I have. I promise you, I have learned. Captain Washington was not finished with Blake, but she could see that her mother was tired of the confrontation. Grace had spent 3 days dealing with this man's ignorance, and Lisa knew her mother just wanted it to be over. We will discuss your behavior further in private, Mr. Blake, Lisa said firmly. But for now, I think you owe every person in this room an apology for the display you have put on. Blake looked around the dining room at all the faces staring at him. For the first time in his life, he truly understood how wrong he had been. His prejudice had not just hurt Grace, it had made him look foolish in front of everyone. I apologize, to everyone, Blake said quietly. I was wrong, and I am sorry. The dining room remained silent as Blake walked slowly toward the exit, his head hanging in shame. Captain Washington watched him go, then turned back to her mother with a smile. After Blake left the dining room, Captain Washington helped her mother organize the scattered research papers. The other passengers slowly returned to their meals, but many kept glancing at Grace with newfound respect and curiosity. I need to handle this situation properly, Lisa told her mother quietly. Blake's behavior cannot go unpunished. Grace nodded, understanding that her daughter had responsibilities as the ship's captain. Do what you need to do, sweetheart. But remember, hatred only breeds more hatred. Lisa squeezed her mother's hand. I will remember, but I also need to make sure this never happens again to anyone else on my ship. 20 minutes later, Captain Washington stood in the ship's main briefing room with Blake and 2 security officers. Blake sat at a small table looking much smaller than he had in the dining room. His expensive suit was wrinkled and his face was pale with shame. Mr. Blake, Captain Washington began, her voice formal and cold. You are here to face charges of passenger harassment, disturbing the peace and destruction of personal property. Blake looked up with surprise. Destruction of property? I did not break anything. You scattered my mother's research papers, Lisa replied. Some of those documents are irreplaceable originals containing information that exists nowhere else. Your actions could have destroyed work that took months to complete. Blake's shoulders slumped. I did not realize how important they were. That is exactly the problem, Captain Washington said. You did not realize because you did not bother to learn. You judged my mother based on assumptions and prejudice instead of facts. She walked around the table to face Blake directly. Under interstellar travel law, harassment of passengers is a serious crime. You followed my mother around the ship, made threatening comments, and created a hostile environment for her and other passengers. Blake tried to defend himself. I was just expressing my opinion. I thought she did not belong in first class. Your opinion was based on racism, Lisa said bluntly. You believed that a black woman could not possibly afford a first-class ticket or deserve to be there. That is not an opinion, Mr. Blake. That is prejudice. One of the security officers stepped forward with a tablet computer. Captain, we have reviewed the security footage from the past 3 days. Mr. Blake approached Dr. Washington on 15 separate occasions to harass her. He also made discriminatory comments to other passengers about her presence in first class. Lisa nodded grimly. What is the recommended punishment for these charges? Confinement to quarters for the remainder of the journey, plus formal charges filed with colonial authorities upon arrival, the security officer replied. Blake's face went white. Confinement? But I have business meetings scheduled. I cannot be locked in my cabin for 10 more days. You should have thought about that before you decided to harass my mother, Lisa said without sympathy. Your business meetings are not my concern. Blake stood up desperately. Captain, please, I made a mistake. I apologize to your mother. Surely we can work something out. Captain Washington studied Blake's face carefully. She could see that he was genuinely frightened, but she was not sure if he was sorry for his actions or just sorry he got caught. Mr. Blake, do you understand why your behavior was wrong? She asked. Yes, Blake said quickly. I judged your mother unfairly. I was prejudiced and rude. And why was that wrong? Blake paused, thinking about his answer. Because she is an important scientist who has done great things for humanity. Lisa shook her head. Wrong answer. Try again. Blake looked confused. I do not understand. Your behavior would have been wrong even if my mother were not a famous scientist, Lisa explained. It would have been wrong if she were a cleaning lady, a cook, or any other person. Every human being deserves to be treated with basic respect and dignity. Blake struggled to understand. But surely someone's accomplishments matter. A person's accomplishments may determine their social status or income, Lisa replied. But they do not determine their worth as a human being. My mother deserves respect because she is a person, not because she is famous. She walked to the window and looked out at the stars. Mr. Blake, I have commanded this ship for 2 years. I have seen passengers from every walk of life. Rich and poor, famous and unknown, human and alien. Do you know what I have learned? Blake shook his head. I have learned that a person's character matters more than their bank account or the color of their skin, Lisa said. I have seen wealthy passengers who were cruel and selfish. I have seen poor passengers who were kind and generous. I have seen humans who were worse than any alien I have ever met. She turned back to face Blake. You showed me your character over the past 3 days. You were cruel to someone who had done nothing to hurt you. You judged her based on assumptions instead of facts. You made her journey unpleasant because of your own prejudice. Blake hung his head in shame. You are right. I was wrong about everything. The question now is whether you can learn from this experience, Lisa continued. Are you sorry because you got caught? Or are you sorry because you realize you hurt an innocent person? Blake was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the captain's question. Finally, he looked up with tears in his eyes. I am sorry because I hurt your mother, he said quietly. She never did anything to me. She was just trying to travel in peace, and I made her life miserable because of my own ignorance. Captain Washington studied his face and saw something she had not seen before. Genuine remorse. Mr. Blake, I am going to give you a choice, she said. You can accept confinement to quarters for the rest of the journey, or you can accept an alternative punishment. Blake looked up hopefully. What alternative? You will write a formal letter of apology to my mother, and to every passenger who witnessed your behavior, Lisa said. You will also attend educational sessions about diversity and respect with the ship's counselor, and you will perform community service in the ship's lower decks, helping to clean and maintain areas used by economy-class passengers. Blake's pride fought against his desire to avoid confinement. The idea of cleaning toilets and mopping floors was humiliating for a man who owned several companies. If you choose the alternative punishment, Lisa continued, you will learn what it means to serve others instead of thinking only about yourself. You will also learn to see the ship's crew and economy passengers as human beings worthy of respect. Blake realized that Captain Washington was offering him a chance to redeem himself. She could have simply locked him in his cabin, but instead she was giving him an opportunity to grow as a person. I accept the alternative punishment, Blake said quietly. Good, Lisa replied. But understand this. If you cause any more problems, if you show any more prejudice toward anyone on this ship, you will be confined to quarters immediately. There will be no second chances. Blake nodded. I understand, Captain, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. Captain Washington dismissed Blake and the security officers, then sat alone in the briefing room. She thought about her mother's words about hatred, breeding more hatred. By choosing education over pure punishment, she hoped to turn an enemy into an ally. But the real test would come when Blake had to face the other passengers again, knowing that they had all seen his shameful behavior and heard the truth about Grace's accomplishments. The next evening, Captain Washington invited all first-class passengers to a special gathering in the main lounge. She had spent the day thinking about everything that had happened, and she realized that Blake's behavior was a symptom of a larger problem that needed to be addressed. Grace sat in the front row wearing a simple green dress. She had spent the day reading congratulations messages from colleagues across the galaxy who had heard about the successful Zephyrian peace treaty. Many of them were planning to build on her work by making contact with other alien species. Blake entered the lounge quietly and took a seat in the back row. He had spent the day working in the ship's lower decks, cleaning bathrooms and helping serve meals to economy-class passengers. The work was hard and humbling, but it had given him time to think about his actions and their consequences. When all the passengers were seated, Captain Washington stood at the front of the room. She wore her dress uniform with all her medals and ribbons, presenting an impressive figure of authority and competence. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the lounge. I have asked you here tonight to discuss something important. What happened in the dining room yesterday was not just about one man's bad behavior. It represents a challenge that humanity faces as we expand into the galaxy. She gestured toward the large window showing the stars outside. When humans first left Earth, we brought all of our problems with us. We brought our prejudices, our fears, and our tendency to judge others based on appearance rather than character. An elderly woman named Betty Miller raised her hand. Captain, surely things have improved since we began colonizing space. Lisa nodded. In many ways, yes. But as yesterday's incident showed, we still have work to do. My mother faced discrimination, not because she lacked qualifications or achievements, but simply because of the color of her skin. She walked over to stand beside Grace. I want to tell you more about my mother's story, because it illustrates both the problems and the promise of humanity's future in space. Grace looked up at her daughter with a mixture of pride and gentle concern. She had always preferred to let her work speak for itself, rather than seeking attention or recognition. My mother was born on Earth in 2332, Lisa continued. At that time, many people still believed that certain races were naturally inferior to others. When she applied to universities, some schools rejected her applications without even looking at her grades or test scores. The passengers listened intently, some looking uncomfortable as they recognized similar prejudices in themselves or their families. But Mom was determined to become a scientist, Lisa said. She worked twice as hard as her classmates, earned perfect grades, and slowly proved that talent and intelligence have nothing to do with the color of someone's skin. Blake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, remembering his assumptions about Grace's qualifications. When the colonial expansion began, Lisa continued, Mom was one of the first xenobiologists to study alien life forms. She made discoveries that helped humans survive on hostile worlds. She developed techniques for communicating with non-human species that seemed impossible to understand. Lisa paused and looked around the room. But even as her achievements grew, she continued to face people who judged her by her appearance first and her abilities second. A middle-aged man named Robert Chen spoke up. Captain, why are you telling us this? Because yesterday you all witnessed something shameful, Lisa replied bluntly. You saw a man harass and insult one of humanity's greatest heroes, and most of you did nothing to stop it. The passengers looked down at their hands, embarrassed by the truth of her words. I understand why you stayed silent, Lisa continued. It is easier to avoid confrontation than to stand up for what is right. But silence in the face of injustice makes you complicit in that injustice. She walked to the center of the room so she could see everyone clearly. Humanity's expansion into space has been successful because we learned to work together despite our differences. We have colonies with people from every nation on Earth, speaking dozens of languages and practicing different religions. Lisa gestured toward the window again. Out there among the stars, we have encountered alien species so different from us that communication seemed impossible. But humans like my mother found ways to bridge those gaps. We succeeded because we valued diversity and different perspectives. Betty Miller raised her hand again. What does this mean for us going forward? It means that humanity's greatest strength is not our technology or our weapons, Lisa replied. Our greatest strength is our ability to include different kinds of people and learn from their unique experiences and knowledge. She looked directly at Blake. Mr. Blake, you spent 3 days trying to exclude my mother because she looked different from you. But her differences are exactly what made her able to communicate with the Zephyrians when no one else could. Blake stood up slowly. Captain, may I say something? Lisa nodded. Blake walked to the front of the room, his face showing genuine emotion. I have spent the last 2 days thinking about my behavior, and I am ashamed. I was not just wrong about Dr. Washington. I was wrong about everything I believed about human worth and dignity. He turned to face the other passengers. I have worked in the colonies for 20 years, and I always thought success came from being tough and aggressive. I thought some people were naturally better than others, but yesterday showed me how blind my prejudice made me. Blake looked at Grace with respect. Dr. Washington, your work prevented a war that could have killed millions of people. You achieved something that I could never accomplish, not because of your race, but because of your intelligence, patience, and dedication. Grace smiled gently at Blake. "Thank you for those words, but remember what Lisa said. Even if I had not accomplished anything special, I would still deserve to be treated with respect." Blake nodded. "You are right. Every person deserves dignity, regardless of their achievements." Captain Washington addressed the group again. "The species that have failed in space are the ones that tried to maintain rigid hierarchies and exclude anyone who was different. They became weak because they wasted the talents of their own people." She pointed to her mother. "The Zephyrians initially thought humans were inferior because we looked different from them, but when they met my mother and saw her intelligence and kindness, they realized that appearance means nothing compared to character." Lisa walked over to the window and looked out at the stars. "Humanity is exploring a galaxy filled with thousands of different species. If we want to succeed out here, we need to value every human talent and perspective. We cannot afford to waste anyone's abilities because of prejudice." She turned back to the passengers. "Each of you will return to your colonies and your lives after this journey. But I hope you will remember what you learned here. I hope you will stand up when you see injustice, and I hope you will judge people by their actions rather than their appearance." The room was quiet for a moment as everyone absorbed her words. Finally, Frank Miller, the elderly veteran who had defended Grace in the observation deck, stood up and began clapping. Soon the entire room was applauding, not just for Grace's achievements, but for the lesson they had all learned about human dignity and potential. Later that evening, Grace and Lisa shared a quiet dinner together in the captain's private dining room. They talked about Lisa's career, her challenges as a young woman in command, and their hopes for humanity's future among the stars. "I am proud of how you handled this situation," Grace told her daughter. "You could have simply punished Mr. Blake, but instead you tried to educate everyone." Lisa smiled. "I learned that from you, Mom. You always taught me that the best way to fight ignorance is with knowledge and patience." Grace looked out at the stars through the dining room window. "Humanity has so much potential out here among the stars, but we will only reach that potential if we learn to see the value in every person." "We will get there," Lisa said confidently. "It may take time, but we will get there." As the Celestial Dawn continued its journey through space, carrying its passengers toward New Haven, both women felt hopeful about the future. They had witnessed the worst of human prejudice, but they had also seen the possibility for growth, understanding, and change. Blake spent the rest of the journey working with the crew and learning about the lives of passengers from different backgrounds. By the time they reached New Haven, he had become a different man, one who understood that humanity's diversity was its greatest treasure among the stars.